Hi, and welcome to the Working World. I'm Karen Mendez.
And I'm Jamie Lingham.
Jamie, we just had the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Sean Gallagher, the Director at Centre of New Workforce at Swinburne University of Technology. Sean is one of Australia's leading experts on the future of work, and he works with leaders to help their businesses effectively leverage their workers in a digital economy and a disruptive environment. None less than the pandemic, of course, Jamie. What an amazing session.
Look, I tell you, Karen, I mean, we've had so many great guests on the show, and Sean is no exception. It was so interesting that someone who's actually looked at how people are working, looked at remote working, flexible working, but also reimagining the new office. It was, the data that he got to work with, he worked with states and territories that locked down and those that weren't, and so to be able to have that comparison on how people actually approach work, but more importantly how managers and leaders work with their teams to extract as much value out of this as possible and build the future of how they're engaging with their employees.
There was there were obviously three main findings out of the report, and I won't spoil it. You can watch it to find out, but I think one of the most surprising things for me was that flexible workers appear to be the less productive, whereas the whole narrative during the pandemic thus far has been, we're working remotely and we're thriving. So it kind of seems at odds of what the messaging has been thus far. But it was interesting to hear some of the details behind that.
Absolutely, and lots of great nuggets in this conversation. I know personally I was taking notes and thinking of how we could work as a business with that. I know you were as well, and I'm sure the listeners will get just as much.
They will. Enjoy, guys.
Right, enjoy it.
This one's for you. Cheers.
I'm out of the box. Okay. Morning, Sean. Welcome to the Working World. I understand you have been super busy with your report, Flexible Work and Hybrid Models. How are you going?
In 2 words, I'm exhausted. It's really been a tough year this year. But of course, before I get into that, it's great to have this opportunity to have a chat to you about the changing ways that we're working. And that's partly why I'm exhausted. A lot of the I was talking to a colleague earlier today about whatever happened to going out for the odd occasional Christmas lunch or end of year celebration. And all of that seems to have completely evaporated. It seems like all those discretionary and non-compulsory bits of work have completely disappeared and filled up with work. And it's been a long year. It's been a tough year here in Melbourne. We've done lockdown like no one else. And I'm looking forward to the end of the year.
Yeah, Sean, thanks personally from me for joining us, where Jamie and I have been talking about and very keen to speak to you in relation to your report and to hear about some of the findings for that. So if you can muster some energy, we'd love to hear that from you now.
Oh, great. Thanks very much for the opportunity to talk about it. And so the report is called Hybrid Working 2.0. It's about humanizing the office. And, we've done a lot of research on the Australian workforce because that is really a critical driver for understanding how work itself is transforming. And, perhaps we're in a unique or a novel situation with flexible working in that this is a huge change management, transformation that's going across the economy. And I'm struggling to think of other sort of economy-wide transformations that's actually being driven by the worker. This isn't a response to macroeconomic trends, but this is really a change in behavior and expectations that have come out of working from home, which is now converting to, flexible working expectations. And I suppose the headlines of the report they're probably 3. And so we go into understanding about flexible working. And I think it's important to say at the outset, we're talking about knowledge workers here. We're talking about, white collar workers, those who would have traditionally been based in an office, but whose work, because of, sophisticated technologies, both virtual as well as, smart technologies that help people do work, it allows people to work from anywhere, such as Denmark and WA. But what we found is that pretty much we wanted to understand what workers' expectations of their working arrangement was going to be like after COVID. Hopefully that's soon. And we found that by far and away, the predominant expectation was workers want to be flexible. The next was sort of equal pegging, with those who still see themselves working primarily from an office and those primarily working from home. But when we there were two things that were interesting in that part of the research, was that every worker that had a work from home experience wants to convert to flexible arrangements. They love the work-life balance. But when we explored a little bit further, we asked questions about, once the pandemic is over, how many days ideally would you like to spend in the office each week? And flexible workers were roughly half and half. But what was really interesting is home-based workers, those who primarily want to work remotely, still want to go into the office 1.5 days a week. And those who primarily want to be in the office don't want to be in the office the entire week. They want to be roughly about 1.5 days away from the office. So in other words, flexible working is expected of all workers. So all workers want some flexibility in their working arrangements. And when we look at the generational change, it's most strongly held by Gen Zs and millennial workers. And in terms of the knowledge workforce, that's about 60% of the workforce. In other words, generational change is going to lock in flexible working. And, just to round out this first headline, but we found that flexible working actually isn't working. When we looked at how we looked at home-based workers, flexible workers, and office workers over the last 3 months, and we had a really fantastic it was like a natural social experiment, because parts of the country, Adelaide, Brisbane, and Perth, they weren't in lockdown, and so office-based work was continuing as normal, whereas Sydney and Melbourne were in harsh lockdown. And we were able to do some comparative analysis between the two. And what we found is that so we looked at workplace well-being across those three categories: home, office, and flexible. So flexible workers, by far and away, they were the happiest out of all of them. So, they felt the best about themselves, but they were least able to function effectively in doing their jobs. So they loved the work-life balance that gave them the highest levels of job satisfaction, but they were least productive. They were least engaged with their work. They were least able to take a break when they needed to, and they were least connected to their organization. And if all workers are going to become more flexible, there's some alarm bells ringing here, and which leads to sort of the second finding of the report, which is we actually need a new approach to hybrid. I think organizations till now have seen hybrid as a logistical exercise. Who works where and when, and trying to manage rosters and who's in the office and how many days and so forth. But if you compare to office and home-based workers, the difference with flexible is there's not only the added complexity of solving the where and when, but at the same time, we also found that flexible workers they were least able to know what they needed to do most of the time, and they were least able to collaborate easily with their team. So flexible working is too complicated. And what we think is that hybrid needs to lift its from just trying to solve that logistical problem to actually looking at the purpose of work. And there's a lot of research coming out of the US at the moment, and here in Australia, in the Productivity Commission, for example, which shows that working from home, remote working, is actually really good for individual focused work. What our research has done is shown that the office is ideal for unsurprisingly, relationship-based type work, from creativity to, meaningful collaboration, to brainstorming, to that fast, messy, complex kind of work. So what we think is hybrid working should actually look at the comparative advantage of different locations, so that, let's make it easier for those flexible workers by saying, when you're at home or remote, this is the type of work you do here. But when you come into the office, you put on a different hat. And it's really about, at home, you're doing work. And when you come to the office, it's about working together with people in a meaningful kind of way. And the third, which is sort of like an extension of that, is we actually see that what we call the new office is really central to this new way of seeing hybrid working. We need to blow up previous conceptions of what the office was and reimagine it around meaningful human interactions. And so that you don't come to work to process email. You don't even come to work to do team meetings. You come to work to be creative and to innovative. And there's a whole range of thinking around that we've put into the report, which I'm happy to discuss with you. But to sum up, flexible working is here to stay. It's not working. Hybrid working, we need to move to a much more purposeful approach about work and differentiating it, and that the office is central to that.
Ron, I know we're booked in for an hour, but I'm telling you, this feels like my head is just like fireworks everywhere, right? Like,
question.
I know. I'm just like, oh, what about this? And let's go into that. And so,
I'm trying to control myself.
clear your day. Otherwise, we're making this a 6-part series, I can tell you, because I love all this stuff that you've done, and it's good that it's broken down to the 3 areas. I suppose starting off with the flexible arrangements, for me, it wasn't a surprise that millennials and Gen Z have picked this up quickly, because I suppose that suits their sort of lifestyle and, their access and use of technology. What I was really interested to hear is you say, and I suppose it's funny, pre-COVID, the whole flexible workforce had been this concept. I don't necessarily think it had been a reality, and COVID seemed to force it into the front, into the fore, really. Everybody was actually making sure that, this is how we had to do it. But you saying that they're less productive, they're the least productive, the least engaged, the least able to take a break, and the least connected. Can you just expand on that a bit? Because obviously, as employers, as mobility professionals and HR professionals, and obviously as managers, I'm sure we're all thinking, hang on a second, we've got these arrangements, but I've got someone who's less engaged or less connected. How do we, I suppose, if you can just expand on that a little bit and just say how you, if you can explain how you see us getting around this, or actually working to make them more productive, more engaged, more able to take a break, and more connected.
Yeah, this is a huge dilemma that organizations probably don't realize that they're facing. At the one hand, how do you accommodate the workers' expectations for flexible working? And it is strongly held, right? It is an absolute deal breaker for more and more workers. They want flexibility, or they're going to go to an employer who offers it. But at the same time, at the other, how does an organization accommodate those expectations, yet maintain productivity, engagement with work, et cetera? I think the initial approaches to figuring out, those hybrid models, many organizations they've taken in many cases, a laissez-faire kind of approach, allowing the worker and their team to figure out, when are you going to work from home, when are you going to come into the office, and that's pretty much the level. But work hasn't been differentiated. You have the same workload over a 5-day week, and you just, wherever you are, that's what you do. But so there's the logistical challenge that flexible workers have is a complexity that they haven't had to deal with before. One of the great things that I think we all recognize about the whole work from home experiment was, how easy was it to hold a meeting and meet with many more people? You didn't have to figure out where you're going to park or find the room or make sure that everything was set up. It's much easily done. So flexible workers all of a sudden have to revert to solving those those hygiene and mechanical logistical challenges. But at the same time, they because of that, we need to better understand why. But my thinking is that they're the least socially connected to their organization because they're still trying to figure out these logistical challenges. So that's why I think rather than allowing workers to make their own choice, we think two things. One is, first of all, separate work. What works best where? And that way you're taking away some of the complexity that workers have to deal with in understanding how they work flexibly. But the second thing, which I think is really important for organizations, is that align flexible working to the organizational needs, right? And so that there are creativity needs and innovation needs, and making sure that you're actually constantly creating value. It's not just about worker output, it's also about worker impact. And the office and coming together on a regular basis of sorts is actually critical for that impact, that value creation type work that'll enhance social connection, that'll enhance work engagement. One of the things that we were really surprised about was that the flexible, so if we just break down work engagement for a second, one of the things that we were really surprised about, work engagement, we measured 5 things. Engagement, so ability to zone out and not be distracted. Meaning, I worked on tasks that had a meaningful impact. Growth, I had access to L&D opportunities. Motivation, I felt motivated at work. And purpose, I felt I had purpose and meaning at work. Flexible workers were, overall, they scored the lowest on all of that. So, it's more than just this logistical challenge. It's perhaps they're trying to figure out, the employers have put it on the flexible workers to figure it out. And in doing so, they're a little bit lost at sea. And that's why we think, having a much more of a proactive approach from the organization to say, this is what you do at home, this is what you do at work, will actually start to re-engage them with work. They'll feel more meaning and more purpose, and be better able to take a break because they know what they're doing and not just where and when.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think it makes a lot of sense around using a place or a space to perform work for its purpose, rather than, I guess, just having a blanket rule of doing your work continuously across multiple spaces, be that the office or be that home. And you kind of touched on this concept of when coming into the office, you would, and apologies if I'm kind of paraphrasing this incorrectly, but you're coming into the office to do that more collaborative work. Is there, do you think remote workers should make a greater effort to do that, given that they're in the office probably far less than flexible workers? And also they should be carving out time, not only to focus on, purposeful work while they're in the office, but also that face-to-face social interaction, I guess, time with colleagues, rather than it just being solely coming in to do a purposeful activity and then returning back to their home location.
In 2 words, most definitely. But it's not just about collaboration. I think that one of the things that we're all surprised about is that over the last couple of years, collaboration has continued pretty well through virtual environments, and that allows us to work remotely a lot more. But what's really essential about coming together on a certain, cadence, it's about relationships, right? It's the meaningful human interactions that occur and really best done in person. They don't have to happen every single week, for example, but at the same time, those, building up empathy and trust and really, connecting on a human level allows you to do everything else you need to do in the workplace. But there's also, I think it's important to take a whole of organization view on this. One of the things about, collaboration tools and virtual technologies is that they've been really good at helping us stay connected with our teams, but at the expense of connections across the organization, right? And so I think that coming together on site from time to time for remote workers, and increasingly, there's a larger proportion who want to stay remote, but it's really important for building bridges across the organization, not just in terms of, building their own social capital, but for the organization's perspective in terms of, when we have to solve a complex problem, we need a diversity of perspectives, and knowing everyone around the organization that we can actually bring to focus on these increasingly difficult challenges is essential for the organization. So it's not just about collaboration coming together. Yes, that's part of it, but really it's that fundamental human need to connect and to belong and to to feel like you're in an organization. I've got one of the lines that I've put in the report is that human interactions, I think, are the dark matter of organizations. And just like dark matter keeps rotating galaxies from flying apart, it's those meaningful human interactions that keep organizations together, particularly when they're attached to a greater purpose, both from a personal development perspective, but also the organization's purpose itself.
It sounds like it's the human in contact element rather than the, we've all been, on Zooms and we've recently as a business done a few sessions, like a couple of all-day Zooms, which is, it's not only hugely exhausting, but that has had the collaboration, of a number of people who are working towards a common goal. So what I'm understanding from you, it's the actual physicality, the location that's going to be that extra step. Is that right? Is that what you're finding?
Yeah, so if you look at a couple of examples, like Atlassian and Canva. So Atlassian, they have an anywhere working policy, and it's partly because they recognize that the talent that they need isn't within the geographical catchment area of their office, right? And, I saw Scott Farquhar, who's one of the co-founders, he said that 30% of their workforce is in regional areas to take up the lack of skills supply, if I can put it that way, in and around their offices. So that's very much, but at the same time, there's an expectation that you come into the office, a few times a year, but you don't come in to do work. It's about, maybe focused around a work conference, but it's also about social gatherings and informal connections and really building those, meeting the people that you would never otherwise normally meet in the cut and thrust of business as usual. What we used to call those water cooler conversations or meeting in the lobby or so forth. Organizations actually have to curate that now. It has to, you don't want to be overly prescriptive, but you do want to set up the platform but change the mindsets of why you're coming into the office. And so Atlassian is doing it. And likewise, Canva is doing the same thing too. They have, likewise a work from anywhere policy, but all team members have to come together at least twice a quarter from wherever you are. And they're focused particularly on the Australia, New Zealand, economies, but you have to come in and, that bonding and that human connection that is really essential for the success of every business. But it's also, I think from a, human perspective, it's also about identifying and, being part of a bigger thing. And, those immensely human interactions are essential for that belonging.
Sean, when you're talking about, this human connection or this, I guess, dark matter, as you refer to it, my mind kind of starts to think about, and it touches a little bit on that have and have nots concept around, do you think, or has your report shown that as this, I guess, state of hybrid working, flexible working, remote working continues, that we're going to start to see a disparity between progression or development of people who show their face more, see themselves in the office, get themselves in front of leadership more so than perhaps the virtual worker who probably equally makes those connections, but virtually? Do you think that physically being in the office and physically being in front of leadership is going to bode well for your development versus being wholly and solely with the odd coming and going virtually.
Yeah, this is proximity bias is always a thing that I think organizations have to be quite wary of. And of course, no organization is going to say to a particular worker, no, you can't come into the office as often as you're doing. But there's two sides of this coin. I mean, there's a plus, and the negative side is this proximity bias. But on the plus side, it allows if they have a flexible approach, it allows them to have a much greater diversity of workforce than they otherwise would have had.
Sure.
Mums who have caring duties, or other workers who have caring duties, as well as neurodiverse and workers and other minorities who might not be able to work in a standard office environment. All of a sudden, that all of their talent is now available. But at the same time, there is that proximity bias challenge but we also have to recognize that some workers, they just can't work at home, and that they do need to go into the office to do that routine kind of work that you would expect, that could be done anywhere, for a whole heap of reasons. We've got a bunch of flatmates, or I live in a shoebox, or poor connectivity, or whatever it is. So,
or kids. You've got to escape from your kids when you're homeschooling in lockdown, I can tell you.
Yeah, and I think that's why organizations do need to curate those occasions where people come together to be with people, and to do that throughout the year.
You said at the start of our discussion that you were quite lucky in the fact that you could look at a number of different states and territories who are in their own phases. So, for example, Victoria being the gold medal of lockdowns in the world, compared to West Australia, which has been sort of fairly good. Have you seen a difference in the responses from the people in Victoria or the lockdown states compared to those that weren't locked down, and I suppose the productivity of the businesses or the success of the business? Have you seen that there's a lag or a drag in the lockdown states when compared to a state or territory that wasn't locked down?
Yeah, we didn't look at at the company level, but across the board. So one of the things that was quite surprising was, those workers who were remote were by far the most productive. I should stress that we didn't measure productivity directly. This is all about self-assessed measures, but they're actually pretty good proxies. Workers know when they're being more productive and less productive, right? And it actually aligns pretty well to traditional measures of productivity. Home-based or remote workers were by far the most productive out of those three categories: home, office, and flexible. What was really surprising was the low productivity, that the office actually wasn't the best place for productivity, right? And so that allowed, so we found, if you think about home and remote workers, we were all in the office one time. So we're able to do that comparison because, home remote workers were office workers once. They have a similar benchmark and understanding for productivity as those left in the office. So, we were able to see that remote workers were more productive than those office workers in, non-lockdown affected areas. The other interesting result that came out was that, because, Adelaide, Brisbane, and Perth didn't really have the lockdowns that we had, but nonetheless, there was still a huge increase in the expectation of flexible working after the pandemic is over. So, we can certainly understand workers in Sydney and Melbourne, they've had work from home, they like the work-life balance, they want to convert to flexible. But we see that is actually now influencing expectations right across the country.
And you mentioned that flexible workers are the happiest. So does that kind of lead to a greater focus is needed on the well-being and happiness of remote workers from organizations?
Yeah, I think there is absolutely front and center need to focus on remote workers. As I mentioned to you in our little pre-chat, I'm exhausted. I think a lot of workers are exhausted. And what we think is happening, and certainly the data out of the US is confirming this, is that for remote workers and home workers, the commute has been replaced by work. And so an 8-hour day is now a 10-hour day. And because employers really aren't being prescriptive about how workers work from home. They've recognized that there are kid interruptions, or they have to, maybe do exercise throughout the day, which is great on one levels, but there aren't any clear markers for workers at home or remote as to, when do I start work, when do I stop work, and so forth. So coming back to well-being for remote workers, they are the most productive, but they're also the most burnt out. There's huge collaboration overload, email overload. Meetings are getting shorter and shorter and shorter, and they're also multiplying because they're trying to manage a whole. So one of the things about virtual technologies is that there's been a huge increase in what we call asynchronous communication. And asynchronous communication is by virtue of what it means is that you're not necessarily meeting at the same time or in a conversation at the same time. And that's a great thing about virtual technologies, right? It started off with email, but it's increasingly become through a whole heap of different messaging platforms and so forth. That type of way to communicate is fantastic for conveying information, but it's not very good for working with people to converge on the meaning of complex information. And so what we think is happening is that because people are trying to figure out what's going on and trying to figure out in a very complex operating environment, what are we doing this? Why are we doing it? And so they're constantly having more and more meetings to figure it out. Whereas coming together from time to time, particularly say at the beginning of a big project, to work through, to brainstorm, to figure out, to frame the problem and understand what it is we have to do. And then as the work streams become formalized, that's when you can sort of go and work remote. And we think that will actually reduce a lot of the burnout, collaboration overload that a lot of remote workers are having if we do that sense making and converging on meaning together in a synchronous way, and then leave the asynchronous for just doing your delivery of projects and more business as usual routine stuff.
Makes sense.
I'm getting anxious just you talking all about this. I think the level, and I'm being serious, the level of anxiety that it's obvious that these people are going, well, most workers are going through, because they're trying to sort of figure out where they are and am I doing the right thing, and what should I be doing in this particular situation. It's sort of I think people like a level of certainty in what they're doing. Are you seeing that companies are starting more to sort of put up how behaviour should be, how the roadmap should be, how the interaction with the company should be? Because I think that it sounds to me that people are trying to figure it out on their own. If you've got 100 employees all trying to do that, it sort of evolves to me to say, okay, well, maybe companies should be taking more responsibility in how that employees should be working and how they should be interacting with the business and their jobs.
I think companies need to do this more and more. What we see happening is that in some ways, the horse is bolted for many organizations. The expectation of flexible working, but particularly around allowing the worker the choice of where and when to work. We've had some discussions with one of the large banks, and the banks were, like many organizations, they're often thinking about these challenges ahead of the rest of other organizations. And mid last year, they went out and surveyed their workers. How many days would ideally you'd like to be in the office? How many at home? And how do you want to work, kind of thing. But they realized that created a little bit of a rod for their back, because it's created this expectation around flexibility. And now they're trying to rein it back, but be true to their word at the same time. But that's why I think that if we need, if we think about hybrid working, so the way that organizations respond to workers' expectations of flexibility, and in a way that we differentiate work based on location, that's actually going to help change the dial and, and help workers better manage their time remotely and start to put some framework and, borders or barriers around the work that you do remotely and the expectations around that. So there's an opportunity, I think, to restart or to reframe hybrid working, and welcome you to have a look at the report, and hopefully that'll give you some insights.
Sean, I'm sure, like many of us in the HR or future of work space, are familiar with, the term of war for talent, or war on talent. I wondered whether you could speak to your thoughts around the degree of influence that organisational hybrid work policies may have on this, war for talent.
Yeah, I was calling it war on talent for a while, and someone pulled me up, said, that's a little bit creepy. I think it should be war for talent. So
we know what you mean. Okay.
So we certainly talk about war for talent quite a lot, and I think this is the hot button issue. As I mentioned earlier, Atlassian, for example, 30% of their work, you don't have to go very far to pick up a newspaper to see the founders of Atlassian talking about the huge skills shortage in Australia, and quite openly talking about, do we keep our business headquartered in Australia? Do we look overseas? But part of what they have done is allowed this anywhere working, and that has really, this policy has allowed them, and there was 30% of their workforce live more than 2 hours from an office. So they've been able to mitigate the challenge of lack of skilled supply by spreading out. And likewise, Canva has done the same thing. Interesting, an organization like NIB, coming back to the top of our chat, workers want flexibility, right? And almost 1 in 2 say they will walk if not given it. So they're really around that. NIB, recognizing that more and more workers are going to work from home, they're paying those workers $1,200 a year, because NIB is effectively leasing office space in their home. And so it's, organizations, and I think these are just the first steps in terms of policy responses of organizations to figure out remote working, figure out flexible working. And, it's going to be different for different organizations, but recognizing, how do we make sure that we keep this flexible option open, and that, but at the same time, recognizing that it has to be increasingly more than just saying, you can choose when and where to work. We actually need to back it up with something that sort of recognizes that you're taking on some of our risk at the same time.
Sean, there's been a lot of talk about, I suppose, the remote working and all the flexibility that comes with it. But there's a whole group, I think, that, is not getting much attention and hasn't got much attention. That's obviously people who can't work remotely. I'd just like to get your view, the hands-on workers, I suppose, if you want to call it that. I don't know, you probably have a better term than I do. But do you have a sense of how is this creating a two-speed workforce or society, or what are your views on that for the people who are not in this group, not fortunate enough to be able to go work remotely?
Yeah, this is I think this is going to be the issue of 2022. If we just think back to this time 2 years ago, as I think you mentioned, Jamie, flexible working really wasn't a thing. It might have been allowed to, mums who has caring duties or those type of arrangements where employers just wanted to be more accommodating of, to increase the diversity of the workforce, and they recognized they needed to do this. And then all of a sudden along comes COVID and working from home. And what we recognize through all of that is that work no longer has to be location based for knowledge workers. And so all of a sudden we're talking about flexibility. At the same time, over these 2 years, and you mentioned hands-on, I call them frontline workers. There's a whole different, but people who are required to be in a location to do their job. And if you think about the same time, right, over this 2-year period, knowledge workers have been able to work from home. They've got better work-life balance, and they're able to, they've saved a lot of money because they don't have all the costs of going into the office and the transaction costs of the commute and all of that stuff. Their lives are looking, despite the fact that they're doing more work, their lives in general are looking pretty good. At the same time, over these 2 years, our society has gotten through COVID because frontline workers have been working their guts out. You think of nurses and people in supermarkets and our emergency services, and at the same time, they've been working so hard, they're seeing their colleagues in head office having these fantastic opportunities of flexibility. So it's really going to be a difficult issue. We're working with a large organization in the community services businesses. And, their frontline workers have been doing it really tough over the last 2 years, supporting their clients, particularly in difficult periods. Whereas, they've got the knowledge workforce, so those in the head office and those who can work from anywhere. So the challenge for this organization is they need to offer flexibility for their office workers, because otherwise they're going to go somewhere else. But then how do they manage the inequity or the unfairness with their frontline staff? I think, certainly some research that we're going to be doing in 2022 is going to focus very much on what does flexibility look like for frontline workers. Some organizations have already taken steps in this direction. You look at Telstra, for instance. They have a standard 40-hour week. They're allowing workers, say, who are on the poles and wires or doing, call outs, that instead of doing 8-hour days, you can do 4 10-hour days. And so there's some flexibility around that. Other organizations like QBE, I think, they allow workers to not necessarily just work at the one location every time. They can sort of have some flexibility around location, so that, on Tuesdays I need to work from this place because it's close to school. On Wednesdays I need to be here for other reasons. So there's some levels of flexibility that we see coming through. But there's also, one of the things I'm interested in, this is purely just my stream of consciousness, there is a little bit of knowledge work in everyone's job. There's always, processing email and doing that routine stuff. So I think that what we could do is start to look at jobs, be it, a Telstra technician or someone who's working in a bank, and start to, tease out what is that bit of the knowledge work that they actually don't need to go into work to do, and maybe that could be part of a flexible arrangement for them as well. But we're certainly going to be taking a strong look at this in 2022, and I think it's going to be most keenly felt in organizations that have these, this workforce across knowledge and frontline.
I wonder if there's going to be danger money for frontline workers, because they're sort of, while everyone else is working safely from their bubble at home, the frontline workers, as you said, the supermarket workers, the nurses, everything have been working at the coalface, and it'd just be an interesting thing, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Equally, Jamie, I wonder whether when it comes to mobility and assignments, whether we'll start to see some compensation incentives around sending people back out on assignment, especially to those locations that haven't quite caught up on the vaccine regimes and are perhaps being left behind in the global fight of the pandemic. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see what 2022 holds out. We look forward to seeing that report, Sean. Sorry, yeah, you too. Maybe after you have a rest. I just wanted to pivot back quickly just to knowledge workers, and sorry to labour on this point, but I'm curious, because one thing that I know I'm certainly seeing, and I'm sure a lot of other organisations are seeing, is there is increased requests from employees now to, now that things, well, for a moment there seemed a little bit better on the pandemic front, borders were relaxing for a moment, people are rushing to go back to their home countries, visit their families, and hey, PS, employer, can I work while I'm there? And I'm thinking about those organisations who don't have a big global spread of offices where, you know, the PE risk is a lot less. Did your study bring any of that about, or do you think that's perhaps another focus area for 2022? How do we manage as HR and mobility practitioners these people who want to blend personal and business trips, or personal and work trips together that kind of bleed outside the already permitted policies?
You know, COVID disrupted more than our connections with colleagues, right? It disrupted our connections with loved ones and friends, not just across the world, but also, you know, here in our own country. And this is going to increasingly be, I think, who's taking the lead on this? Perhaps unsurprisingly, you know, the big four consultancies, because they do have offices all over the planet. So let's just take a look at that for a second and understand what they're doing. These, you know, year on year, if you look at the preferred employers, you know, the big four consultancies are always in the top 10, right? Everyone wants to work there. Yet they also recognize that in this war for talent, that even they need to provide these opportunities for their workers to, you know, when you work from the UK for, 3 months and you get to reconnect with your family, because they themselves are worried about losing talent. So if these big organizations are so worried about the need to provide this flexibility in a geographic, across the world kind of sense, then I think increasingly other organizations will have to likewise try to figure it out. But I think it just speaks volumes that such highly sought after employers, they themselves are really very scared about losing their own talent. And so this is a response to that.
So just, I suppose, on the last point, you brought up 3 points at the start of the conversation, and coming into the last one, which is the new office. So, you know, having this new way or reimagining the office around human interaction. Are you seeing companies are starting to do this now, or is this you know, at the very start of where we are? And should practitioners and should leaders of businesses start to think about this and actually have sessions to do this and create this new office, including all of those additional benefits that they'll be giving people with the option to work from other countries or, you know, wherever?
Yeah, I was lucky to be on a panel yesterday with some really terrific people, and there was a fellow from MYOB and someone from Rio Tinto. And they were talking about repurposing their office around those very specific type of activities that should only occur in the office. But for the most part, what we've seen is that organizations, most organizations are run by baby boomers, and they have a very traditional view of what occurs in the office. We actually need to reframe the office completely. And so one of the things that we think that, if we don't reframe the office, workers are going to go back in and revert to type. They're going to go back to old office habits. And one organization, Salesforce, for instance, they knew that they needed to have new collaborative spaces, and they developed that. And then they watched their employees, and employees would go in, sit at their laptop in these purpose-built collaborative spaces and just do work for themselves and not connect with anyone. We need to reframe the office. And I think that there's two ways. We need to create rituals for the new office. For example, on a Tuesday morning, when you come together, the first thing you do is a brainstorming session. Or that we create, at the end of every month, it's a meet and greet, not just of new employees, but meeting employees from across the organization. And that's what you do in the office. So we need to reset our mindset, but also I think we need to program activities that take advantage of what the value of the office as an asset actually gives the organization. So, bringing teams together for learning experiences. So, discussing recurring themes that each might be seeing across various projects, and to understand, well, what's going on here? Is there an opportunity for us? Or curating, even making sure that workers from disparate part of the organizations come together for various reasons. So I think that we need to, organizations, if they have a set and forget kind of approach, we're just going to go back to the way that we were. Organizations need to be much more proactive about making sure that the new office works for them, particularly given that remote working is going to be better done for individual productivity. So let's take advantage of what the new office is, but we need to reset our way and thinking and reimagine what it's going to be. And, one of the things that, yeah, go on.
I was just going to say, I'm just getting this vision of the traditional office where people have been sitting in their cubicle or their desk or in their office actually just typing. I'm sort of feeling like that's out the window, right? There's none of this, I'm coming here to sit and do an email, because I could do an email anywhere.
It's true. It's true, Jamie, but they're also creatures of habit. Like if you think about when hot desking first came in, you could sit anywhere, but what did we do? We went and sat at the same desk every single day, assuming someone did get to it first, right?
I sometimes think that workers almost need two different job descriptions. This is the work you do when you're at home, and this is the kind of work you do when you come to the office, and having a nice separation of the two.
And that's what we were saying before about, maybe it's a collaborative effort where the companies actually help teach people of how they turn up, to each zone. I think that, having an office where it is a social thing, not social as in party social, but as in a socialization, a human interaction, not sitting there, I'm busy, I'm doing emails, sorry, like let's work on meaningful projects and collaborative projects. And then I'm working on emails on the train, or not, if I'm driving, not in the car, but when I get home or whatever, like to me, a lot of the time it feels like people sit on their, definitely in office space environments, they sit on their computer a lot of the time, doing emails or working on projects, doing whatever. And I think that maybe that collaboration piece, that's sort of what I'm, it's rushing at me, Sean. I think it's a nice picture.
Sorry.
No, go ahead, Sean. You're right.
I was just going to say, we're working with a company called Hayworth, which is an office furniture company, and they're both the data they have, but also working with clients that individual workspaces, in terms of an office layout, they're cutting in half, whereas collaborative spaces are tripling in size in terms of the footprint. So it's really important that organizations not only have these activities, but actually redesign the space appropriately.
I kind of am thinking about all the hard work that all these people, HR, facilities, security, are putting into all these spaces, and I guess ritual's a nice word to use in relation to kind of developing these more collaborative and social habits in the office. I fear greatly though that just like we've all found as humans over the last 2 years, organizations their resilience is going to wane with these constant emergence of new strains, new variants, which send our offices back into lockdown, and all that hard work, gets put on pause. I just wondered whether, Sean, and I guess my final question for you, if you have a crystal ball, what do you think the impacts will be outside of that, resilience and that kind of turning it off and turning it on? What do you think the impacts will be to future work plans, hybrid work programs for organisations that have to deal with these emerging strains and the uncertainty around how governments that they're working within will react?
Yeah, so I'll crystal ball a bit, but based on data that we've got. So in the most recent research, we wanted to understand the impact of the Delta strain when the Delta strain was a thing. And in terms of their motivations and inclinations to come back to the office. And we found that almost 1 in 2 workers were less inclined to come back to the office. They wanted to stay at home while the Delta strain was still a threat. So I think with Omicron, I think it's perfectly safe to infer that Omicron will have a similar impact on workers. They're likely to be less inclined to return to the office while this is still a threat. But I think what's different to Omicron compared to Delta is the cumulative effect, right? Workers will, we're talking about habits and rituals and so forth. The longer workers are working from home, the more that becomes a habit and an expectation, and that's just the way that they now work. And so I think the longer this goes on, Omicron or any future variants, that getting workers out of the mindset that they actually do need to go into the office, but for things that they don't do at home, I think it's going to be an increasing challenge.
Wow, I tell you what, we have absolutely eaten up our time together so quickly. Sean, it has been really insightful. Thank you so much for coming and sharing your learnings, from this report. And I certainly look forward to future reports or future research that you're doing. I can see your head sort of moving on different directions of where the next step is and how it's going to go. But I think it's extremely valuable, particularly for the viewers of our show, just given their positions and just giving some good insights. You probably noticed I've been typing furiously, not only just so I can keep up with the conversation, but also I've got ideas flashing in my head of what we need to do in our business. Yeah, so I'm sure everyone else will get just as much benefit out of this.
Yeah, thank you, Sean. I can only imagine the amount of work that you put into this. So on behalf of the whole of the HR community globally, thank you.
Thank you, and thank you very much for the kind words. It's and of course, welcome feedback from anyone. If any of your viewers want to learn more or even challenge me, that's the way we learn, right? It's
absolutely.
So welcome that aboard, and of course, thanks very much for the opportunity. It's been a really great time to chat with you.
Pleasure.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Okay,
Sean.
thanks, Sean.
Take care.
Have a great week. See ya.
Thanks.